Good afternoon. My name is Paul Ryer, and I am the Director of Scholar Programs here at the School for Advanced Research. Welcome to this afternoon's Wednesday Colloquium presentation. Thank you, a special thanks to the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation for its generous support of the fellowship that today's speaker and actually our next speaker as well are here under. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Andy Aguilera, who is our Mellon Fellow, one of our two Mellon Fellows. Andy is a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And his project while here at SAR is titled Negotiating Mexicanidad, Race and Nationalism in Mexican Los Angeles during the Mexican Revolution, 1880 to 1940. Please join me in welcoming Andy Aguilera.
Thanks, Paul, and hi, everyone. My name is Andy Rafael Aguilera, and I'm a doctoral candidate at the University of Michigan's History Department, and I am one of this year's Mellon Fellows and Resident Scholars at the School for Advanced Research, where I will be working on my dissertation. First off, I want to thank the SAR for hosting me, as well as the staff for providing immense help in moving here and transitioning to this academic year. Also want to give a shout out to the resident scholars who have been nothing but collegial thus far. I also want to give a special shout out to my mom, mentors and colleagues and family and friends who have helped me reach this stage. So thank you all, I really appreciate it. So the topic of my talk today on Cristero Longing Activism is taken from chapter 3 of my project. So while I'm not going to give you a broad overview of the project itself, I hope that this portion of the chapter gives you a sense of the questions I'm engaging with a broader dissertation. And I hope to receive questions on that in the Q&A session. On April 29th, 1928, Miguel Venegas and his two oldest children attended the celebratory opening of LA City Hall. Spanning over 3 days, the festival's agenda consisted of a mass spectacle that tracked the city's growth as a modern metropolis through its history. First, the $9 million building was greeted with a dedication parade of over 34 bands and ethnic-inspired floats, concluding with the arrival of military units. By night's end, the LA Times reported, the building's beacon would be lit, quote, via direct wire from Washington by President Calvin Coolidge. The finale depicted a historical pageant operated by the native sons and daughters of the Golden West, which largely worked to illustrate the city's progress through a narrative of U.S. conquest. The City Hall's grand opening celebrations claimed to start a new period of LA history as a modern urban site in the American West. It also sought to claim domination over previous eras through their subjective use of history within the festivities and City Hall architecture. Quote, whereas 140 years ago, proclaimed the LA Times, Padres and the Buddha Dons trod deserted plains, yesterday a city of upward of 1,500,000 people gathered to dedicate a sheer tower of white, symbolizing a new era of accomplishment and progress for the Pacific Southwest. The pageant sought to depict a more colorful version of LA in 4 eras: pre-conquest, the founding of the mission system, the Spanish period, and the coming of U.S. soldiers. In one broad stroke, the building narrated LA's eclectic ethnic history to portray the advent of American progress over their Spanish predecessors. At the same time, however, the pageant romanticized California's famous missions and the Spanish arrival as the first white men who invaded the West to further solidify their vision of the region defined by whiteness and progress. As a spectator, Miguel Venegas thus consumed a curated narrative of LA's history through progress. On another level, however, Miguel's perspective represented the immense connections LA held with Mexico and Mexican Americans, and vice versa. Writing to his brother in Mexico, Miguel described the view of the vast city from the City Hall's 27th floor. Arriving just 2 years prior to the City Hall's completion, Miguel's experience coalesced with LA's blossoming. Part of that flourishing urban sprawl, Miguel and his two sons represented the continued growth of LA's Mexican community. Miguel, however, was not a typical labor migrant seeking better opportunities in the US. Instead, he was a Catholic Mexican exile from the state of Jalisco during the Cristero War of 1926. The City Hall building symbolized a significant shift in Euro-American domination in LA's history as the city grew. With the Venegas family and other similar Mexican migrants during this period, we can see how Mexicans and Mexican Americans begin to see their place within the metropolis in the American West. Far away from his homeland, Miguel Venegas thus witnessed firsthand the growth of LA and potentially his future in it from the 27th floor. So for some, LA represented an urban site of progress. For individuals such as Miguel and others, however, it acted as a site of refuge. I open with this vignette to illustrate the growth of two sects of LA, the city as a key site of the American West, and the vast growth of Mexican Los Angeles, represented respectively by the City Hall and Miguel Venegas. Although a burgeoning urban sprawl in 1928, Mexican origin people found their roots in the city dating back to the late 18th century. From 1781 onward, Mexican origin people witnessed firsthand the growth of LA, first as a Spanish pueblo, then a Mexican capital of Alta California, and finally an American city. These three national periods collectively shaped the experiences and ideals of Mexican people in Los Angeles, which cultivated their notions of Mexicanidad and nationalism. My dissertation, entitled Negotiating Mexicanidad, Race and Nationalism in Mexican Los Angeles During the Long 19th Century and Mexican Revolution, seeks to unpack how Mexicans express and define their identities from the 19th century up to 1940, a period which witnessed key moments. My project is chiefly concerned with two interrelated but separate analytics, Mexicanidad and nationalism. Much of my research interests center on the formation of Mexican identity in U.S. history, particularly within the Southwest. Like other scholars within Chicana studies, I contend that there is no one authentic version of Mexican identity, but a plethora of variations and articulations of it. So Mexicanidad, or Mexicaness, quite literally means the qualities of being Mexican. The term allows us to consider the diversity and fluidity of the Mexican experience and the ways in which the group defines themselves during various historical contexts. In my research, the fluidity of Mexicanidad is seen, but so are the hotly contested debates that try to pinpoint the true qualities of being Mexican. On an interrelated note, I utilize nationalism as an analytical category to unpack these articulations, as well as to map out Mexicans' ideas of the Mexican nation. Political scientist Benedict Anderson famously points to nationalism as a recent 18th and 19th century phenomenon in the Americas. Anderson defines a nation as an imagined community as it presupposes a sense of union with individuals we have never met and often will never meet. Nonetheless, this imagined community comes with very real ideals that define nationalism, namely a common understanding of history, traits, beliefs, and attitudes. A large part of my project focuses on assessing the Mexican Revolution's impact in Los Angeles and the ways in which it shaped Mexicans' notions of Mexicanidad and nationalism. The Mexican Revolution erupted in 1910 in response to Porfirio Díaz's refusal to acknowledge and respect democratic elections after a 30-year dictatorship known as the Porfiriato, after a promise to do so 2 years prior. Formally elected in 1877, Díaz pursued a policy of conciliation and worked to industrialize Mexico. Although successful, his policies only benefited the upper classes and catered to foreign investors, many of which had accumulated a vast majority of Mexico's land and resources at the expense of the peasantry and indigenous populations. As a result, popular discontent from below had begun to form against the dictator. In 1910, the centennial of Mexican independence, Francisco Madero, a leader of the anti-re-election movement, took Díaz's promise of democratic elections at face value and pursued the presidency. Díaz subsequently imprisoned Madero, as well as any other political opponents who challenged his rule. A year later, Madero crossed the border and settled in San Antonio, where he mobilized a plan of attack against Díaz. Madero's rebellion succeeded, yet the Mexican Revolution was only at its beginning. Although rebels had forced the dictator into exile, there was no uniform platform that enabled the Madero presidency to be successful. By 1913, Madero was executed by forces within his own circles. Mexico then erupted into full-blown civil war between a plethora of elite and peasant leaders who had sought to reclaim Mexico as their own. Although scholars disagree on the conclusion of the Mexican Revolution, they agree that the violence and social unrest greatly shaped modern Mexico, as well as the US-Mexico borderlands. For instance, between 1900 and 1930, over 1.5 million migrants crossed the US-Mexico border. Between 1910 and 1915, the most violent years of the Mexican Revolution, the Mexican population in LA rose from 5,611 to roughly around 35 to 40,000 by 1915. In short, it not only contributed to the growth of Los Angeles, but also reinvigorated a Mexican community with what I call a revolutionary diaspora, consisting of immigrants, exiles, and refugees. So I'm interested in how this diaspora understood the Mexican Revolution's politics and how it shaped their notions of Mexicanidad and nationalism in their new urban setting. Like Mexico and the Mexican Revolution, these articulations resulted in a variety of debates within Los Angeles to show a nuanced diversity of the Mexican-American experience in the US and their relationship with Mexico. The Venegas family was part of this revolutionary diaspora, as the revolution largely contributed to the relocation from Mexico to LA in the late 1920s. Born in Zapatanejo, a small town in Jalisco in the western part of Mexico, Miguel and Dolores Venegas were married in 1919. There they enjoyed relative comfort, where Miguel operated a successful convenience store. Dolores' grandfather's 5 haciendas also gave the Venegas family more financial comfort. By 1926, the family, who regularly attended the church every Sunday, had 4 boys. That same year, however, life would change abruptly for the Venegas family. That change would come directly from one of the Mexican Revolution's crown jewels, the Mexican Constitution of 1917. That liberal constitution focused on a variety of issues that directly caused the Mexican Revolution, namely the loss of land and lack of rights for Mexican citizens. As such, the Constitution focused on remedying these issues with land reform and in establishing human rights for Mexicans. The Constitution also included implicitly and explicitly an onslaught on the Catholic Church in Mexico. For instance, Article 130 prohibited the church from engaging in politics, while also allowing the government to intervene in its affairs. Others directly challenged the church through the nationalization of its property and restrictions on religious orders. So too were devout Mexican Catholics undermined under Articles 24 and 5, which banned public worship and religious education. In essence, these limitations on the church's influence sought to secularize Mexican society and reinstate the Mexican government's hegemony on its citizens. Although not immediately enforced, the expansion of these measures worked to revitalize church-state tensions in Mexico. Speaking on behalf of Mexican Catholics in January 1926, Archbishop Jose Moray del Rio refused to recognize the infringing measures on church practice and declared they would be prepared to fight them. In response, President Plutarco Elias Calles notified bishops and priests that the articles would be implemented, and subsequently banned foreign clergy members and shut down Catholic schools. That same summer, Calles announced penal reforms known as the Calles Law to punish those who broke them. This law reiterated the seriousness of church restrictions as ones that would be put into practice, and publicly assured those that broke them that they would be punished. After months of increased conflict and tensions between the church and state, the Catholic Church suspended all activities on July 31st, 1926. Popular protests from devout Mexican Catholics as a result turned into militarized activity known as the Cristero War, a rebellion that would last from 1926 to 1929 across west central Mexico. Miguel Venegas directly participated in the Cristero War by joining the town's branch of the Union Popular, an organization chiefly interested in the defense of religious liberties in Mexico. Miguel attended the group's meetings and distributed propaganda at a store. He also played a small role in the armed conflict when he was recruited by Miguel Gomez Loza, one of the party's leaders, to guide rebels through the local highlands terrain. His participation caught the eye of Don Rosario Orozco, a local political boss and ally of the Mexican government, who subsequently seized Miguel's assets and threatened his life. Sensing great danger, Miguel made the hasty but pragmatic decision to seek refuge in the U.S. Thus, in May 1927, Miguel crossed the border without his family at El Paso to make his way to Los Angeles, And then later on in September of that same year, Dolores and the two boys would join Miguel. However, while in Los Angeles, the family regularly wrote to family members left behind in Mexico, where they exhibited coping strategies of their exile and affection for the Mexican nation. For the Venegas family, letter writing acted as a strategic tool of communication and as a continued linkage to their home community. Moreover, they also worked to maintain personal relations. The letters of the Venegas family ultimately functioned to reconcile their uncertain and difficult experience between two spaces. These documents fulfill three categories of negotiations on purposeful writing identified by historian David A. Gerber. First, regulative writing, which aims to continue contact with distant ones to organize and maintain those relationships. Second, expressive writing that recounts the lived experience and emotions. And finally, the description of daily life and state of affairs defined as descriptive writing. Taken together, the experience of the Venegas family helps us to understand a unique perspective of Mexicans during this turbulent period. Miguel's initial months in Los Angeles proved difficult in adjusting to his new life and the confusing status surrounding his exile. First working as a dishwasher in Los Angeles, Miguel lauded the pay in comparison to what he would have made in Mexico. Quote, "Even more could be earned in the fields," he wrote, "but he will not last long in such hard work." Separated from his family, Miguel also lamented the impact his exile, if long-term, would have on Dolores and his family in Mexico. In doing so, he weighed the scenarios that would best benefit his family should they remain back home or join him in Los Angeles. Miguel thus referred to his exile and displacement, as well as those surrounding him, in the language of suffering and sacrificing. Yet he made sure to alleviate these concerns by comparing his hardships to those more unfortunate, without money, without work, and in a strange land, far from their people. In other instances, he continued to reconcile his nostalgia for Mexico by weighing the benefits of living in Los Angeles. Miguel thus made the best of an uncertain situation for his own sake, but also for the family he left behind. In doing so, he kept open the possibility and hope of returning to Mexico, while also realizing that LA might just be a temporary home. He also exhibited a transnational life in which he attempted to balance his experience in LA with his old one in Mexico. He wrote often to his brother Francisco to settle his struggling storefront in Mexico. After his abrupt departure, Miguel was left in debt to various creditors after the business's seizure by the local government. Rather than leaving the debt unresolved, Miguel made an effort to settle it for the sake of possibly returning back home. So operating his newly opened grocery store in LA alongside his debt problems in Mexico provided great frustrations for Miguel. The long workdays left him tired and unable to fully assess his business matters, which further prolonged its settlement. As a result, he often weighed the possibility of cleaning his slate and distancing himself from the situation completely by leaving his debt unresolved. If he did so, however, that would mean the impossibility of returning home. He then pointed to his family in Mexico and his love for his homeland as the main factors in preventing the liquidation of his business. This balancing act and negotiation illustrates two important dimensions of the Cristero diaspora. First, it showed that life left behind in Mexico could not be ignored due to the sudden decision to seek refuge in the U.S. In the case of Miguel, he likely felt a sense of responsibility to resolve his debt to protect the livelihood of family members left behind. Second, it also projected the ways in which he clung to his life and memory in Mexico. By noting the love for his family and nation, Miguel remained hopeful that he would return one day. The situation provided even more uncertainty for the Venegas family by keeping their sense of belonging connected to Mexico, thereby claiming LA as a temporary fortress of refuge. Dolores Venegas expressed her own difficulties in adjusting to life in LA. Though only a few letters remain from Dolores, they reveal a more familial and urgent tone compared to those of Miguel. The gender dynamics of labor, it appeared, kept Dolores busy and unable to communicate as regularly as she had wished. Apologizing to her mother-in-law for the lack of contact, she blamed work at the grocery store and around home for leaving little energy or desire to write for 2 hours. Nevertheless, she frequently shared the family's immense desire to return back home. For instance, in 1932, she wrote, quote, We are always with the desire of returning, and we see that the day never comes. God knows how long we will remain here. She continues by assuring her father-in-law that the boys had hardly forgotten anything about their homeland and family. This practice functions to remind family members that Mexico remained in their minds and that a return was possible. In doing so, they refreshed their familial bonds. Such declarations of longing and returning home were not merely statements to maintain familial bonds, however. Rather, they held out hope of their eventual return and spoke much of it. As a young Jose Miguel, the oldest of the Venegas children, noted, quote, "We just seemed to say we will return and doubted that the plan would come to fruition." Like his parents, he also recalled life in Mexico and yearned for a return. Using a youthful imagination, he wrote to his uncle that he and his brother were saving money to purchase a car or train tickets to return. Quote, "Which way do you think we will end up going back?" queried young Miguel. From the Venegas parents to the children, the family placed much emphasis on the significance of residing in Mexico in their first few years in Los Angeles. Still, Miguel and Dolores took the necessary steps to adjust to their new life there, in the case that it would be a long one. In addition to the opening of his grocery store, they enrolled Jose and Ricardo in a Catholic school. There, they began to learn English and receive a Catholic education they so valued. Compared to other Mexican families, the boys' enrollment in a Catholic school held much significance for the Venegas family in molding their children to Catholic culture and values. As products of the Cristero diaspora, freedom of choice between a private or public education was not merely understood in the language of liberty. Instead, it represented their Catholic values greatly threatened in Mexico. By enrolling the children at a Catholic school, they thus remapped their vision of a Mexican life in an unfamiliar landscape. By 1929, the conclusion of the Cristero War, the Venegas family remained skeptical of Mexican affairs. Miguel expressed the broader distrust Cristero's supporters held towards the Mexican government by noting the corruption in Mexican politics that included, quote, "the supreme government placing the preferred candidate as the Mexican president." He continues by quoting, "That and the dirty work by the caquitos contribute to making a country a place where liberty is found in the countryside, and only as long as the wild beast and his cubs are not disturbed." So while Cristero politics varied greatly, this skepticism reflected Venegas' stance that viewed the terms of political representation and liberty as additional factors. The general distrust reveals the revolutionary legacy's effect on Mexican affairs and the ways in which Mexicans, such as Venegas and other Mexican Catholics across the U.S.-Mexican borderlands, grappled with it in the context of the post-revolutionary period and Cristero War. This distrust thereby made the possibility of repatriation a difficult and unlikely prospect. On the 3-year anniversary of Miguel's departure, he noted the lack of change in affairs that prompted his and many others' departure. Rather than looking backwards towards his residence in Mexico, he remarked, quote, "One has to look ahead so as not to be left behind." Such an outlook began to let the notion of permanent residency in the U.S. sink in further. The critique and distrust of the Mexican government also reflected challenges to notions of race and nation. As seen, Miguel held immense skepticism of the Mexican government. Yet the physicality of the nation itself remained important in his mind. The experience of exile and migration created great uncertainty for Venegas and other Cristeros. These experiences, in addition, forced many to assess their relationships to the Mexican nation, whether residing there or in the U.S. context. Though the Venegas family expressed much longing and hopes for their eventual return, they would not do so if persecution and corruption reigned. Patriotism, Miguel felt, meant nothing if the government treated its citizens like slaves. The only other option was to find refuge in a place where, quote, "tranquility of spirit and a tranquil conscience was within reach." Here, Miguel emphasizes the contrast between political oppression in Mexico to that of political freedom in the U.S. If the letters represented and expressed coping strategies of migration and exile, then residing in LA allowed for political freedom and served as a canvas in which to build a Mexico de afuera, which quite literally means Mexico outside of Mexico. Living outside of Mexico did not necessarily tarnish the bonds of Mexican citizenship or identity for Miguel and the Venegas family, but instead served as a place in which to practice one's ideals of Mexicanidad and nationalism threatened by the Mexican government. This suggestion also puts negotiative strategies of longing in prior letters in better perspective. In other words, coming to terms to living permanently in LA and the United States, in positive language, highlighted the rights and liberty denied back in Mexico. Still, if one could construct a Mexico de afuera, it could not fulfill the same experiences as living within the confines of Mexico. After 3 years in Los Angeles, Miguel identified liberty, namely that of freedom of religion, as an evident feature of American life. An assertion rooted in his Cristero experience, the freedom of religious practice made Los Angeles, despite its difficulties and separation from family, a pivotal site of sanctuary. The possibility to pursue a Catholic education in LA remained one of the most appealing factors for the Venegas family. Receiving this education in the US, however, could not simulate the same experience the children would have received in Mexico, or so the family thought. Though he listed it as one of the positives of their exile, Miguel regretted that the children would not be able to receive a Mexican education, which would instill in them, quote, Mexican ways. Though Miguel does not expand on the meaning of this category, he perhaps lamented the loss of instruction on Mexican history and culture. Whatever the case, he reasoned, they would not be able to appreciate their country nor love it. Living outside of Mexico did not destroy Miguel or Dolores' sense of Mexican identity or patriotism. The same, however, could not be said for the children whom they feared were losing connections to the homeland. In few instances, the family thus began to refer to the Venegas children as Chicanos. Perhaps this marked their distance and lack of upbringing in Mexico. In any case, Dolores first used the term in 1930 in reference to her children in a letter back home to their grandmother. The term seemed to have caught on in Mexico with the family, as a letter from their aunt referred to the Venegas children as Chicanos and Americanos, who she yearned to meet. Referring to the children and nephews in these terms suggests an ethnic identity family members begin to place on Mexican children born and raised in the U.S. context. Distance from Mexico and the lack of love for it, therefore, would cultivate a new ethnic identity the Venegas family recognized in this new context. The Venegas family's contact with other Mexican peoples in LA also solidified their own unique version of Mexico de afuera, defined by the Cristero experience. The city, in other words, brought them into contact with other compatriots they might not have otherwise encountered in their small village in Mexico. As a result, these encounters largely illustrated their versions of Mexicanidad, one constructed from daily experience in LA, but also in relation to Mexican society and politics. Upon moving to the city, Venegas identified Belvedere, located in East Los Angeles, as a worthy site of relocation based on reliable information that Mexicans resided there. Still, Miguel did not romanticize the compatriots he encountered. When rumors of increased immigration enforcement surfaced in 1929, Miguel described the bad treatment Mexicans received from the U.S. government. However, he blamed the plight of Mexicans due to their ignorance and behavior in which many think they are in Mexico. Miguel did not appear to be critiquing his compatriots' behavior per se, but instead found another platform in which to lambast the Mexican government. He shifted the blame in the same letter from the Mexican community to, quote, the revolution of 19 years because they had presented a very bad spectacle to our country. If early critiques of the revolution and its aftermath, as expressed by Miguel, cultivated an era of lawlessness and repression, then it served to produce Mexican citizens in that same vein. Likewise, as a Cristero, Miguel seemed to make contrasts between Mexican Catholics, such as himself, and other Mexicans in Los Angeles. In doing so, he inadvertently defined Mexicanidad as inherently Catholic in nature and politically anti-revolutionary. By 1930, 3 years after the Venegas' family's arrival in Los Angeles, Miguel expressed immense anxiety that those in Mexico had forgotten about them. In a concise letter, he angrily asserted, quote, being that there are 5 of you who write a few lines, it surprises me so much time has gone by without remembering the absent ones, and it appears to me that little by little you are forgetting about us. In a similar vein, Dolores wrote home that, quote, it has been a long time since they received letters, and expressed her worry to the family. Such fear and anxiety show the significance of letter writing as a strategic tool of coping with migration and separation. As a form of regulative writing, the letters serve the purpose of maintaining familiar relationships in a reciprocal context. As David A. Gerber notes, this process measures respect and affection for the other. Miguel's tone and apparent fear in the above letter thus unveils the immense anxiety of being forgotten by his loved ones, but also losing ties to his home community he hoped to rejoin one day. While most of his correspondence engaged on updates and in resolving business affairs, Miguel made sure to include a few lines to refresh kin bonds. As such, the expressed fear acted as a moment of rupture and vulnerability for Miguel that showed the importance his family and homeland held for him. Likewise, Dolores' worry resulted not only for the well-being of her family, but also in the potentially deteriorating correspondence she so cherished that maintained her ties to Mexico. Although both eventually fulfilled their wish to move back to Mexico in 1940, they returned to LA in 1942, thereby showcasing how they had successfully adapted to life in the US with their business there and their children who resided there. Like the opening of City Hall, Miguel and his 2 children experienced in 1928, the Venegas family had become an integral part to the growth of LA and its Mexican community. In addition to letter writing, Cristeros found other ways to mobilize in defense of their religion and nation in LA. On January 6, 1935, during La Segunda in Mexico, the second reiteration of the Cristero War, Pedro Villaseñor and others denounced the formation of the Comité Popular de Defensa Mexicana. The group Villaseñor shared would pursue, quote, social propaganda through a newsletter to be distributed to Mexican colonies throughout Southern California. Villaseñor believed that Mexican consuls and other communist groups disparaged the Catholic Church via flyers and word of mouth across the U.S.-Mexico borderlands. For him and other organizers of the Mexican Popular Committee, Southern California and the broader U.S.-Mexico borderlands had essentially become a new battleground in the Cristero struggle. This, though, would be more of an ideological front more than an armed conflict. The Popular Committee published and distributed a provocative newsletter to combat rumored attacks on the church in Southern California. This activity thus made Southern California and Los Angeles a new front for the Cristero War, where exiles such as Villaseñor took part of. Far away from the Mexican government, these organizers purported to offer, quote, truth and justice through their newsletter. They found a small but eager audience for their efforts. In May 1935, the newsletter solicited readers to suggest a new name for the weekly newsletter. An unnamed reader from Flint, Michigan suggested Pro Patria, for one's country in Latin, as the new title. Leaders of the Popular Committee adopted this name as it neatly summarized their supposed mission as a popular voice of Mexicans that defended humanity, freedom, and religion in Mexico. By and large, the newsletter asserted a vision for the past and future of the Mexican nation that would hinge on the outcome of the Cristero struggle. They thus countered the Mexican government's populist rhetoric with a conservative agenda that which kind of bordered on fascism, as we will see. These themes are best seen in the newsletter's interpretation of Mexico's history over several of its early issues. These issues emphasize the Catholic Church's supposed contributions to the modernization of Mexico, namely through the evangelization of the region's indigenous people and in erecting the pillars of civilization. They start their history by describing God's awesome power in creating the world and its people. The Lord God formed man from the mud of the earth, they write, and inspired the face of the spirit of life and became the living man with a rational soul. Marking the start of the Mexican state with the book of Genesis involves two interrelated strategies. First, the authors asserted that God was the prime authority in the creation of the earth and its inhabitants. By repeating this initial creation story, God could ever be central to the Mexican state and its people. Second, it linked Christian beliefs to Mexico's origin in an implicit argument that the two could not and should not be disentangled from national memory. Thereby, to separate the church from the state, as the Mexican government had done, was to shed the identity of Mexicans and the nation state. The authors describe that the Americas were hidden for so many years from civilized and Christian nations. Only when God exercised his, quote, infinite power did Mexico become part of the Spanish Empire, who then Christianized Mexico, and this is the history that they pursue. They therefore painted Mexico's indigenous peoples as subjects who only benefited from Christian evangelization. Their polemic posits two questions, the first being, what was the civilization of the tribes that populated Mexico? And second, what was his degradation and his brutal and fierce savagery? They answer these questions by disparaging the Aztec Empire as a backward civilization. Although they claim the Aztecs were among, quote, the most brilliant of those who populated pre-conquest Mexico, they nonetheless deemed them a violent and oppressive force. Its leaders, they claimed, were selfish, immoral, and decadent. The newsletter highlighted ritual cannibalism to make its point. As an empire, they lacked, quote, patriotic love, and the Aztec subjects had no autonomy. In short, its leaders failed to unify its subjects under a harmonious national identity and oppress its subjects. The authors thereby implicitly positioned the Aztec Empire as a reflection and warning of their contemporary Mexican government, who they believe were destroying Mexican national identity. Only the allegedly peaceful missionaries of the Catholic Church would save the proto-nation and his people through its evangelization. Not surprisingly, the newsletter often conflated religious doctrine with Mexican nationalism in modern civilization. The article entitled El Patriotismo del Pueblo Judío, the patriotism of the Jewish people, offered another historical parable for its Mexican readers. The paper referred to Jewish people in biblical times as a homogeneous nation, which descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The article continues by describing the wrongful displacement in Palestine at the hands of the Roman Empire. As generations passed, the authors note, the Jewish population continued to scatter across the world, always, quote, a foreigner living outside Palestine. Nonetheless, it suggests the Jew is always Jewish. Even long after Jerusalem has been destroyed, the temple scattered throughout the world, the Israelite always feels an Israelite. The publishers clearly intended the Mexican readers in the U.S. to connect to this story. It made clear that the Jewish diaspora's status as an exiled and persecuted community did not prevent them from feeling a sense of patriotism. And here's a longer excerpt from this history. Quote, the Jews are expelled from Palestine, scattered throughout the world, but they always retain their fierceness. Their hope is always alive, and even though Jerusalem is first converted into a pagan city and then to a Christian city, their memory is always living in the heart of the Jews. It is the lost homeland, but not forever. Perhaps someday the children of Israel will return there to rebuild for the fourth time that temple, center, and life of the Jewish homeland. So a religious motivation is the reason for being of Jewish patriotism, end quote. Like the Jewish diaspora, the newsletter reminded Cristeros of their displacement and persecution by their home governments. Despite living outside of the confines of Mexico, the editors intended their readers to reassert their ongoing connection to Mexico and their identity as Mexicans through a supposedly timeless patriotic love and duty to the homeland. For Cristeros and perhaps non-Cristeros, this passage intended to be a symbol of hope and mobilization. By invoking and relating the biblical Jewish experience, they reminded leaders to remain resolute in their identity. They thus elevated Mexico beyond a nation state into a holy place as a religious and racial homeland. As the article concluded, Mexico, quote, must be kept in mind when it comes to establishing the nature and reason for patriotism. In this way, Cristeros in LA expressed their ideas of Mexicanidad and nationalism with the Catholic Church at its center. The Venegas' family's struggle of exile, as evidenced through their letter writing, expressed their longing for the Mexican nation and lamented the loss of aspects they considered key to their Mexican identity. Likewise, the popular community in later years worked to defend the Catholic Church's contributions to the formation of the Mexican state and its people. The Venegas family, Villaseñor, and members of the popular committee ultimately looked towards returning to a peaceful Mexico, where the Catholic Church's influence would be restored and acknowledged. That hope, however, would not come to fruition. In 1936, Villaseñor looked at developments southward with, quote, astonishment and indignation, and resigned himself to living at the doorsteps of his patria. That doorstep, the US-Mexico borderlands, initially believed to be a temporary refuge, thus transitioned into a permanent home for many Cristeros. For others, it represented a part of their transnational lives in which they routinely crossed the border back and forth from the US and Mexico. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Andy, can you hear me?
Yeah, hey Paul, how are you doing?
Oh, terrific. Wow, that was fun for me. I have to tell you, just before we get into the Q&A, as you know, I work with Cubans and in Cuba, and some of the parallels between what you were describing with this beautiful, intimate family story mixed with the bigger picture, really similar to what one could see in Miami. Yeah. A really interesting overlap. So I think we could talk all year long about that. For those just joining us, this is the Q&A portion of today's colloquium presentation. And please put any questions you may have into the Q&A. It's at the bottom of your screen there. I see that we have at least one question to start with, but I'm hoping we'll get more, and we can start with those.
Sure.
I do just see one question, so I'll start with that. And the question is from an anonymous attendee. What do you see as the biggest obstacles or conflicts between being Mexican nationals and living in Los Angeles? Biggest obstacles or conflicts?
Great. Yeah, that's a really good question. So I'm going to try to answer this based on the Venegas family perspective, but also perhaps Villaseñor and other members of the Mexican Popular Committee. So for one, it's kind of reconciling betrayal from the home government, which I did note in the presentation there. How do we reconcile that notion of belonging, right? If our Mexican government is challenging our rule, our values of what we define as Mexicanidad, or the values of the Mexican nation state, how do we grapple with that? And I think that's what you see in Los Angeles with the Venegas family, and as well as with Villaseñor and the newsletter. Secondly, and I think it's more profound in this context across the US-Mexico borderlands, it's increasing racism against Mexican peoples, right? Ethnic Mexicans, whether they've achieved US citizenship or not, right? This is an era of a new immigration quota from the Immigration Act of 1924, which institutes the Border Patrol across the US-Mexico border. What some scholars have defined as policing Mexican browns, right? And I think one of the most infamous moments in LA history, it's the 1931 La Placita raid in Bunker Hill in Los Angeles, which is in current downtown LA, where over 400 Mexicans were rounded up and put into vans and deported. And that's the largest story of Mexican repatriation during this period. It starts in 1929 up through the 1930s, in which lots of Mexicans, whether they achieve Mexican citizenship or not, are just deported back to Mexico due to racism and xenophobia that exists. So I think those are the two obstacles that not only Mexicans in LA, but across the US-Mexico borderlands are facing during this time period.
Can I follow that question with another, just
Sure.
Same topic? A lot of immigrant groups have a trajectory from starting as a model minority, being seen as a model minority, towards a more negative stereotype that happened to Cubans. It happened particularly with the Mariel boat lift in 1980. The community's image among Anglo Miamians really became much more negative. And Gina Perez talks about that among Puerto Ricans in Chicago. I mean, I think it's a common phenomenon. Do you see some stuff like that? This move where at first this group is seen as a small, non-threatening, they're Catholic, they're good people, and then a shift towards more negative stereotypes, or was it negative all along?
So I'm going to answer that thinking back to the longer trajectory of Mexican racialization in Los Angeles, dating back to the 19th century, right? And I would say it's always negative portrayals of Mexican peoples, right? Mm-hmm. After the US-Mexico War, whether you're a California elite or vecino, which is a lower class in the social hierarchy that they established. A Mexican in the eyes of Euro-Americans are Mexican, right? And racialized and treated as such, right? So in this case, I think it's always negative. In the case of Cristero's, however, I do think they get some empathy from other Catholic organizations and Catholics in the US, right? Here thinking about the Knights of Columbus and other local churches throughout Los Angeles and Chicago and across Texas, right? And other sites where Mexican Catholics are prominent, right? They get support from such institutions, but I think that's more the exception rather than the rule. And particularly in Los Angeles, I think it's normally just negative portrayals of them in treatment, so.
Well, we're getting questions now, so let me go back to that. Oh, here's the one from Alina Mendez, who was a fellow here last year. Hello, Alina, nice to see your question. Thanks so much for your presentation. Do you see the Mexican patriotism of Cristero groups as a convenient political rhetoric, or do you think it was a genuine sentiment accentuated by exile?
Yeah, thanks, Alina, for the question. That's a very good one. Off the bat, I want to say yes and no. I don't want to dismiss Cristero's emphasis on Catholicism in Mexico, because they take it very seriously in defining their family structure, their values, their idea of what it means to be Mexican. But I also do think there are instances of it being a convenient political rhetoric. And here I'm thinking of Ignacio Lozano Sr., the creator of La Prensa, a prominent Spanish newspaper in San Antonio, created in 1913. In 1926, he creates a counterpart to that newspaper called La Opinión, which is still the longest running Spanish newspaper in Los Angeles to this day, although it's all online, it's not in print. But he uses the Cristero Rebellion and the Cristero struggle for his ends to critique the Mexican government. So in that instance, I think he's using that as a sort of kind of tool to undermine what is happening in Mexico. So yes and no, I think in both instances. We see that as a genuine sentiment. As we see with Villaseñor, in some cases it comes off as fanatical, and it is in some cases. In others, I think it is useful to use the tool as a critique towards the Mexican government.
Another question from Gabriel Melendez. A very important chapter in Chicano Mexican history. I'm wondering if the new Mexican Aurelio Espinosa had some contact with Cristero exiles. Those connections might be worth researching.
Yeah, so that is not a question I can answer, unfortunately, but it is one that I think is worthy of researching, as you said. There has been a lot of work done in the last couple of years on Cristeros, not only in Los Angeles, but across the US. But New Mexico is actually not part of that story. So I think that's something that researchers such as myself and others should look into, right, to show those connections, because New Mexico is unfortunately kind of ignored in Chicano historiography, right? And I think that's something that we need to fill the gap in. And I think that's something I might look into then. So thanks for the question.
Andy, our very first Mellon Fellow 5 years ago was a scholar named David Romo, and David wrote about, he wrote a book here about entitled Mexican Nazis, but about the World War II era, but he also has written a book called Ringside Seat to a Revolution, looking at the Mexican Revolution from the perspective of exiles in El Paso, which is where he's from and works. And so, yeah, it's not just LA. I'm glad you note that, but it is, I think all of us in New Mexico often feel like we get jumped over by the larger scholarship on the larger population centers, both in California and in Texas. And the New Mexican story often does get kind of, it's one of the reasons it's so exciting to have you guys here, to have scholars come for this Latinx Mellon Fellowship, and partly because it's exciting to hear this scholarship, but also I think the New Mexican version of these stories often is enriching to scholars coming here as well from elsewhere. Sorry to go on that, but another question, the next question, how did you find your subjects? Is there a lot of information available about Mexican families during this time?
So the Venegas Archive is actually located at Loyola Marymount University, a small Catholic university in West Los Angeles. It was donated by Maria Teresa Venegas, she was born in 1930 while in Los Angeles. She was the fifth of the 10 kids that the Venegas family has. She actually went on to get her PhD from UCLA. So she donated these materials to Loyola Marymount, which has been accessed by myself and other prominent historians. So I ran into those materials there, and I went into it looking for questions of how they were reconciling sort of the difficulties that I discussed earlier on reconciling betrayal by the government, but also trying to stake their place in Los Angeles in this era of uncertainty for them. The Villaseñor papers actually are a new archive located at the Huntington Library that I found just absolutely fascinating in terms of its recruitment of other Mexicans in Los Angeles in the 1930s, but also sort of the materials that the newsletter is publishing, particularly the history that I give you a little insight into, because it's certainly it's a useful exercise into showing how people use history. In this case, I think in a negative way, right? It's a very racist history. It generalizes what is happening in Mexico in terms of indigenous populations and how the Spanish civilized Mexico, according to them at least, right? So it shows the dangers of history. But in contrast, right, the way I analyze that is to show the potential that history has to examine the ways in which people understand the past, and in this case, the past of the nation state, and constructing those values. So there is a lot of information about Mexican families during this time. Of course, it is a little bit out of the scope of what I'm trying to do with this particular chapter. But as I said, my project commences in the early 19th century. So I do examine a lot of different individuals that express different ideas of the Mexican nation state or their place in Los Angeles and by extension, the United States.
Yeah, I loved that question because I had the same question in mind at a certain point. You know, how did you get a hold of these amazing letters and documents, photos? And it might be a question that a lot of people have, so it might be one worth just noting in a very briefly. This is one of the things when you present a chapter as a standalone talk, people will often want context that you've put elsewhere in your dissertation. You can't cover a whole dissertation though in an 45-minute talk. So it might be one something to just note up front in your intro, because I think a lot of folks will have that very question, some version of it. So I love that one. The next question is from Julia Young. Thank you for this excellent presentation. I wonder if you've been able to get a sense of the proportion of Mexicans in LA who were Cristero supporters versus the proportion who were supporters of the Calles government. Are there any sources you found that can give us a reliable sense of these numbers?
So that is an excellent question, and thanks so much for that. That is something that I myself am trying to grapple with, try to get sort of concrete numbers of who are Cristero supporters in Los Angeles, right? How many of them are there? In contrast, what Mexican nationals are supporting the Mexican government? It is hard to triangulate that, and that's something that I am still looking into the sources, right? My research did get backed up due to the pandemic, so that's something that's still sort of in the back of my mind that I'm trying to figure out. But based on the Mexican Popular Committee and Villaseñor's recruitment, I want to say that the numbers are smaller than I actually think. The organization ends at 1936, and he finds other endeavors to participate in. But through the letters of his recruitment, there are a lot of people who stopped subscribing to the newsletter. So that tells me that he was really struggling to promote this newsletter and the organization for the broader Mexican community, right? While Cristero supporters were there, I think they're quite small, but I'm trying to, again, find a good number to show the depth of this community in contrast to the larger Mexican community that exists in Los Angeles during this period. So I'm sorry, I can't answer that. That's something I'm looking into, but.
Can I ask a question, Andy, that sort of percolates truly out of my own studies between Cuba and its diaspora, and that is very similar dynamics to a lot of what you said, as I mentioned earlier. For example, Miami Cubans will often reference the Jewish diaspora as one comparable to their own. Most famously, they will often say, as a toast, they'll say "El año que viene en La Habana," which is reference the year that next year in Havana, but referencing an imagined toast from the Jewish diaspora of next year in Jerusalem. So very deliberate kinds of self-imagined analogies between their own experience as exiles and the experience of Jewish diasporan Jews. And so so that, for example, is one. But another element of your talk that kind of threaded throughout your talk is the Catholic dimension, and very similarly in Cuba also. But what one can notice in the Cuban case, and I don't know if it's the same or not in your material, is that there's a kind of a class relationship to the religious aspect. And that is to say, the upper classes that left Cuba to go to Miami, and they were the upper classes in that case, were also the most Catholic part of the Cuban population. The folks left behind were perhaps nominally Catholic, but not as demonstrably so, and in different ways. And I could kind of go into story after story on that. And I wondered, that made me wonder, again, I don't know in your case, are there class dynamics at play where the folks who are Cristeros are from a particularly, upper class as well, and where the popular classes left behind in Mexico would have a different relationship to Catholicism? So those are a couple interrelated questions. Sorry.
Sure. Yeah, those are really good thoughts. Thanks, Paul. Here thinking about the Venegas family, they're certainly a middle class family, and they're better off compared to other Mexicans in Los Angeles, right? Miguel owned his grocery store in Mexico, and then opens one in Los Angeles, right? And he can afford to pay the head tax to legally cross the border to make his way to Los Angeles. And as I know in the talk, right, he talks about how other Mexicans are struggling, not only Cristeros, but other Mexicans are struggling to survive, right? Keep in mind, this is during the Great Depression, right? And somehow Miguel makes it through, even though the grocery store is struggling. But he does so with his class connections that he has back home, right? Dolores, I think before she goes to Los Angeles, she sells some cattle to get over $1,000 to help Miguel and help them move to LA. And the family in Mexico still has capital, right? So in their case, they are middle class and more affluent compared to others. I can't quite make the judgment with Villaseñor as the others, but I would suspect it's probably the same case. And again, to answer that second part of the question, I think that's something that requires a transnational kind of analysis for me to look at his family in Mexico, right? Mm-hmm. So I might have to dig into the archives, which I do plan to, right? If this pandemic ever, goes away, Mexico, and look to see how, that class dimension there's preventing Mexico Cristeros to maybe go to the US, right? To find a safe haven, right? Because not everyone can afford to do that, right? Not only Cristeros, but just in general, Mexican exiles or refugees. Not many, during the Mexican Revolution here, I'm thinking, it's prominent Mexicans that are going to Los Angeles or the Mexican borderlands, right? Who are losing capital due to the Mexican Revolution, right? So that's why they're escaping to Mexico. So they are, of middle class, if not higher status. And I think that really shows, why a lot of Mexicans during this period actually hold conservative values and have critiques of the Mexican government. And that's something that I dig into with the broader dissertation in terms of the revolutionary diaspora, but also in the 19th century in the development of ranchero society in California. So,
I mean, I suppose one could flip this around and say, are there social classes not well represented among the Cristeros in Los Angeles, or underrepresented as well? And that, to get at the same question. Anyway, you're right. It definitely requires transnational work, and I hope we're all so sick of the pandemic. We all hope we can get back to things. I don't know. Let me see if there are more questions have come in. Yes, actually, here's another. Thank you for this presentation. Can you speak on the discrepancy between the treatment of Jewish people in the Spanish Empire in New Spain and the use of the Jewish experience in the newsletter you mentioned? That was fascinating to me. Yeah, that's a neat question.
Ooh, that's a really
Tough
neat
one.
question, and unfortunately one beyond the scope of my training in Latino studies and Latino history. I guess to build off of the earlier question, I think that's a very convenient use of the Jewish diaspora. As Paul mentioned, it happens in Cuba as well, right? To strengthen their identity is almost like martyrs, right? At the hands of the Mexican government. Fortunately, I can't answer that. I'm not versed at all in Jewish history, especially in relation to the Spanish Empire. But
well, that is it is a big question, but it's fascinating. And you're right. The question, it's really well constructed because there are clearly dynamics of oppression against Jews in New Spain, and yet here we have a kind of, it's almost like American baseball teams naming themselves the Braves or the Indians or something, right? It's got a very interesting dynamic. Anyway, speaking of baseball, I see that you're clearly an Atlanta supporter. I like your bookshelf. Good luck to the Dodgers. That is the last question we have got. I would love to keep chatting. We're a little over time. Andy, just fantastic work. I'm looking forward to more chats during the year. And we're here to support this project. It's really exciting. Folks, we're going to log off, but please, again, check our SAR calendar. Thanks everyone for logging in. And until next time.
Thank you.
Go Dodgers.
Yeah.